computer. Okay. So now it should be recording. So we're going to be talking about digital photography. And I think the fact that you can record images with a lot of depth, range of brightness, sharp detail and color, with just a file that has a bunch of ones and zeros in it is really remarkable. But the ability to do that has developed so quickly and so dramatically that you can really get images that are as good or better than what you'd see with film photography. This picture of Mount Monadnock from over in Marlborough. The other thing about digital photography is it has created a situation where it's really the greatest time to learn how to do photography. When I was learning photography back way long ago, we took pictures. Maybe some of you remember this sort of thing. In your camera, you did the best you could and you sent them off, and maybe a week or two later, you got them all back in a little packet. And you looked at them, and some were good and some were bad, but you really had difficulty telling why the bad ones were bad and what you did right on the good ones, because there was really no information and you couldn't remember it by then. And so it made it difficult to really learn the craft. Nowadays, with digital photography on most all cameras, you can get all sorts of feedback about your picture right after you've taken it. So you know immediately whether you've done something correct, and you know how to make it better. You can get a picture. By the way, can people see my pointer on the screen?
Yeah.
It's floating around here, floating around the picture.
Yeah.
Okay. So you get a picture, but probably more importantly, you get other information about the image. This is called a histogram and gives you a visual or graphic representation of the brightness throughout the image. We'll talk about this more next week in particular when we talk about exposure. But you also get information about the shutter speed and the aperture, the opening, any adjustments that are made in the brightness, and all sorts of other information about the image. So you've got immediate feedback. And also when you look at these pictures later, all this information is actually embedded in the image. So after the fact, you can also tell what you've got. So it's a great time to have the feedback that you need to figure out what you want to do and what you've done right and wrong. So we'll be talking about the digital photography and hopefully encouraging you to get out there. This is the basic setup of the course. We're going to start by talking a bit about digital cameras in general and the differences between the various digital cameras. In terms of their size and weight, their sensor size in particular, and other factors. We'll talk about handling files. When you take a picture, you don't get a negative you can hold. You have just a file that you have to deal with in terms of archiving and naming and then saving, I would argue, in a number of different places so that you don't lose them. And we'll also talk about controls on the camera very briefly. So that's what we'll be covering on our first day. Later, next week, we'll be talking about exposure and then composition. Over the last couple of courses, I've added a fifth course, which includes a number of things that I had to try to jam into other classes before. And they include things like sharpness and focus, color balance, and also flash. The introduction, at least, to the use of flash in photography. And finally, we'll talk about working with different kinds of light. In New England, we get all different kinds of light. Critiquing your images, the pictures that you take, I think can be very important. Let's see here. I get people, I'm just taking a break because I've got people in the waiting room who need to come in. So I think we're pretty much all here. We've got Jill Dumont, are you there?
Yep.
Okay.
What's my video?
Oh, just turn off your video.
Where's
So
my video?
we've got everybody.
Okay.
You can hear me. We've just gotten started, Jill. So we're just talking about the layout of the course. If you should be seeing a shared screen at this point.
Yep, yes,
It says it has a list of things, including getting to know your camera and so forth. You see that?
yes, I do.
Okay, so we're good. So anyway, we're going to cover these first three topics today, and it's kind of a nuts and bolts kind of session. Not as much fun as later sessions when we talk about exposure and working with light and so forth, but I think important as an introduction to what the characteristics of digital photography. This is the class schedule, which I sent to you in a file. I forgot to put it on the first email, so I sent it on a second, so I hope people got that. The regular classes cover digital camera and files today, exposure, composition, sharpness, color balance, flash, and working with light on the Thursdays. What I've started doing is also adding additional sessions, which I call office hours, which are chances for people to come by if they have questions that I didn't answer during a particular class, or they have questions about their particular camera, or if you have pictures that you've taken that you wanted me to look at and give you some gentle critiquing on, we can do all of that. And that's on the Mondays after the classes, except after the last one. So that's from 6 to 7 on the Mondays, and you can see the dates there. I will be sending a link to those classes within the next day or so. You will notice, by the way, in the email that I sent out that the link to the classes is the same for each class. So you don't have to have me sending you information each time. So we wanted to start with an introduction. Let's see, here we go. Pull this out here. I wanted to figure out who everybody is. Two, three, four, five, six. So I guess we may still be missing somebody. What I'd like to get from each of you very quickly is just who you are, what your interests are in photography, and I'd also be interested in knowing what camera you're shooting with right now. I don't know if you have them right next to you there to hold up, but you can just tell me otherwise. We'll start with AJ.
Hi, I am using the EOS 60 Canon camera, and well, general photographing nature is what I really want, but more than most, I want to shoot the moon's light around in the darkness sort of a thing, moon, shooting the various images of moon by the lake or whatever. And that's a bit tricky because whenever I've tried, I normally get a smudge around over there. And that's not exactly very good. So low light photography is what I really am after.
Yeah. I think we'll talk about photography of the moon in the last session. Just briefly, the trouble that most people think of is if they use the metering on the camera sees basically dark. And so it tries to expose that. And the result is the moon gets way overexposed and it's just a white blob.
Mm-hmm.
You got to realize that the moon is illuminated directly by the sun. It's as bright as a beach on a sunny day. So you have to adjust your exposure to deal with that. And then you can get more detail in it. Okay, Jackie. Oops.
Sorry, had myself on mute. So I am Jackie, and I just got a Leica CL. So I am trying to work with that, get to know all of its ins and outs. I particularly take nature photography, and I really like doing macro stuff. So that, and I would like to learn how to work with water a little bit better. It's a pretty harsh subject, so kind of smoothing that out and learning to control the exposures and all of that to get the right one. So,
Jackie, Leica CL is a viewfinder camera?
no, it's a mirrorless.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Good. Do you know the size of the sensor? Is it a full sensor?
I believe It is not the full sensor. I can't remember offhand, but I could get back to you on that one.
Jan?
I have a Sony CyberShot camera.
Hold it up. Oh, that's nice.
And I just take mediocre photographs, and I would like to learn how to take good photographs of people and landscapes and all sorts of things.
General photography.
Yes.
Great. Okay, Nicole?
Okay, my name is Nicole Tenters. I got, when we first went into lockdown last year, I bought a Nikon D5600. I have no idea how to use it. So I'm really excited to learn a lot of stuff. I have two kids that are very athletic, so I'm looking to increase my knowledge of taking sports photography, as well as, you know, just nature and family gatherings, that kind of stuff.
Now, the Nikon is a digital single lens reflex, right? You look through the lens.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Okay. And Jill?
Hi, I'm Jill. I have a, it's a K5 Pentax.
Okay.
So, I got it a number of years ago. I started, I heard you when I was driving about with the film cameras. I started with film camera Pentax K1000.
Oh, the
back in the
classic.
day. Yeah, I still have it.
We had one of those and I don't know where it went. I gave it to my wife long ago.
Well,
Great
and
camera.
when I went back to start going back into photography or trying to do stuff, I found that the Pentax newer ones would still take the old lenses. So that's where I went with the K5 Pentax. But I've also realized that all my old lenses are, of course, not electronic, so they don't. So
Yeah.
I haven't used. I think I've used my other lenses like maybe twice.
Yeah.
So it was sort of a mute thing of doing or a bad thing of doing, but and I have a daughter that plays hockey, so a lot of it I want to do sports shots, a lot more with sports shots too,
Great.
but it's in a rink, so you have that difference of the light. And then I also, as you saw my picture, I have a dog, and the movement of the dog a lot of times is another obstacle I have. So the sharpness, I think, is what I'm looking for, is trying to get into the sharpness of the pictures.
Great. Okay. Let's see here. Trying to move this out of the way. Here we go. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm still missing one person, but we'll move on. So introducing myself, I started my photography experiences back when I was in junior high school, shooting primarily with 35mm cameras, single lens reflexes. And this is just a few of the cameras that I worked my way through, starting with the SR7, doing primarily color slide photography for years. But I also started doing black and white photography and used a number of different large format cameras, including a 2¼ Yashica Mat dual lens reflex, all the way up to a 5x7 Rosewood view camera, gigantic negatives, 5x7, all of which I had to do black and white. Black and white photography was great for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that I could go into the darkroom. And while I was in medical training, I started doing darkroom work, sticking a darkroom in any corner I could possibly make dark. This was the pantry in our apartment in Newtonville. We were there for about 3 years. And I just kind of stuck in the back corner trying to stay away from all the other stuff there. And it was during this time that I really got enamored with the idea of being able to control the image, all the way from when you first take it to developing the film, and then doing your own printing with my Omega large enlarger here, being able to crop and adjust the appearance by dodging and burning particular areas. Really gave me a sense of control over the images that I didn't have when I used to just take pictures, color slides, and send them off and have them being done. Then everything changed. I had children. And when you have children, you can't come home from work and just say goodbye and go into the darkroom all night. So my darkroom basically disappeared, and I was shooting film and print photographs after that, trying to keep up with the kids. Things changed back again when my kids grew up. By the way, you're going to see a lot of pictures of my kids, so you're just going to have to bear with it. My daughter got her master's in public policy and was in Washington, D.C. for several years. She's now back in Medford, Massachusetts, which is particularly nice because that puts us closer to our new grandson. This is Owen, who is a real cutie now. He's now about 18 months. My son was a little bit less excited about having his picture taken, as you can see here. But over time, he kind of grew up and was a little bit better about having his picture taken. He got a long beard, but he also got a very nice girlfriend. And so they're a little bit more friendly. The end of all this is that the kids were out of the house, so I could have gone back into the wet darkroom, but by then something else had happened, which was digital photography and the development of these amazing digital sensors. Just looking at them, they're kind of pieces of art. But what they do is remarkable in terms of capturing light and being able to translate that to a file that you can deal with. Over time, digital matured. The digital cameras got to higher resolution, and they also went into digital SLRs like the old 35 millimeter cameras. Single lens reflex is what that stands for. And they got to resolutions and sensor sizes that really begin to get images that equaled or rivaled that you could get from good film cameras. High quality inkjet printing came along. The inkjets now, the fine art ones, can develop pictures that are every much as good as you would get from a regular photo lab from film, and actually can have archivability, how long they last before they fade, well in excess of what you'd have with regular film. And finally, I was able to get back into the darkroom, but now with digital editing, not in the dark, wet darkroom, but with programs like Photoshop and Lightroom, I could do all the same things I used to be able to do in the darkroom, but quicker and much better with many more options. So that's why I've really switched to digital photography now, and there's a number of advantages to digital photography that I think are worth mentioning, and we'll talk about in more detail. The first thing about your digital camera is to realize that light is light regardless of what kind of camera you have, and the physics of light in terms of exposure, shutter speeds, and focal length of lenses is all the same regardless of what the sensor is on the back of the camera. So when you're taking pictures with a digital camera, you still deal with the opening of the aperture, which we call the f-stop. That governs the amount of light that comes in and affects the exposure of the image, but also affects the depth of field with a small aperture, giving you a deep depth of field. Depth of field refers to the area of sharp focus within the image. And with a deep depth of field, you can have sharpness in the foreground all the way to the background. On the other hand, with a wide open aperture, you get more light coming in, but you also get a narrower depth of field, so you can have a soft background when you're taking macros. I forget who said they were interested in taking macros. This is a fern unfurling. It should be happening about now, actually. Shutter speed is helpful in terms of recording sports. stopping the action in sports with sports photography. It can also stop the action in nature photography. This is a 1/1600th of a second. And these are two eagles, a juvenile eagle and a mature, basically jousting over who gets to occupy this nest on the Connecticut River. And recording flowing water, which someone else mentioned, to get that soft look of the water. If you like that particular appearance, you just need a long aperture. This was 2 seconds. You can do that with digital as well as film photography. All these new cameras that are coming out have either interchangeable lenses to give you a wide choice in terms of focal length, or they have zooms that can be quite dramatic in terms of how far they can go. You can have, this is a 400 millimeter lens, getting about as close as I wanted to get to a grizzly bear who was looking for salmon in a river in Alaska. Or a wide angle lens, here's 18 millimeter lens that gets a wide look at Central Square in Keene around the time of the one of the last pumpkin festivals. So there's all these different variables which are really the same for digital cameras. As we get to more advantages, I already talked about better feedback, which you can see on the back of the camera. And this, you can assure that there's also good focus. Right, here's another example of, by the way, this histogram that I talked about. A lot of digital cameras have rather fancy autofocus capabilities, not just one area in the middle that you can use to as your focus point, but they can have multiple focus points, and you can adjust whether you have some of them active and some of them not, and move the focus point around. There's a number of things that you can adjust on digital cameras that you never could do with film. You can adjust on the fly. One of them is color balance. When we see a scene that's, say, under incandescent lighting, yellow lighting, our eyes immediately adjust to that and makes it look normal. But cameras don't know how to do that. So if you have your camera set at daylight and you shoot inside under incandescent lighting, it'll all appear yellow. And the nice thing about these cameras is that you can jump between different color settings from picture to picture. With film, you either had to put a filter over the lens or switch your film type altogether. Here's an example of a view inside the Vermont Country Store. Under incandescent lighting with your camera set for daylight, you get this yellow tint. You just make a turn of the dial and adjust it to a tungsten color white balance, and everything looks quite normal. The other thing that you can adjust on the fly is ISO, which is the sensitivity of your sensor to light. You can set the sensitivity way high if you're shooting at night and you're trying to get a picture of the Milky Way, as in here, this was shot up in Walpole. And it was actually a combination of a number of images to make a panorama, so you can see the arc of the Milky Way here. But to see this deeply into the Milky Way, you have to have the sensitivity of your sensor quite high. In this case, I had it set at 3200, which is quite high, as we'll see. If you move, you can take this picture at 3200 and then immediately the next day record in daylight, and you can cut the sensitivity way back to maybe 100, which might be appropriate in a bright sunny day. And you can do that picture to picture, whereas with film, you'd have to take the film out and put in a different sensitivity film each time you wanted to do it, and it was a hassle, believe me. With a digital camera, you can take multiple exposures and they're cheap. And there's a number of situations where this can be helpful. This is Catherine's wedding in Oregon, and this is with her best friend Jessie. And I was able to just click like 5 different images of them standing together, and some of them weren't quite as good, not as big a smile, but I was able to find the one here that seemed to be the best, and then use that one for my picture. Nice thing about taking multiple images. So when I was shooting film, my kids used to get into trouble if I was trying to take a picture of them and they didn't smile. I would say that I was going to charge them 20 cents for each time they did that. But nowadays you can just shoot off all these multiple images and never have any problem. You can do a number of things to get combinations of images. This is something called focus stacking. And this is a series of images of the same scene, this road during autumn. And I'm focusing on different areas within the scene, starting up close and then slowly moving back. And the result is with some software, you can blend these images together and get a picture which looks sharp back to front. By the way, another importance of having cheap images is that I can afford to waste an image by putting my hands out on either side, showing the bracket around a particular set of images. So I can tell among all the images where I'm shooting a series. Result is you get a picture that's sharp all the way through. Now, using these sort of techniques does require software. This is something which is done very easily in Photoshop, but there's other programs that aren't as complicated as Photoshop where you can do the same thing. It's a capability you have with your digital camera, and it's well worth taking the time to figure out how to do it because it can give you much better, in this case, a depth of field than you could get with any particular setting on your lens. Another example of using multiple exposures is to deal with a situation where you have a broad dynamic range. Cool pictures there. Okay. This is a picture of a backlit church in Newfane, Vermont. And the problem was if you expose for the church, you can see that the sky is all blown out and just white. Whereas if you have a picture that's exposed for the sky and gives you nice clouds, then the foreground is too dark. Again, with simple adjustments in a program, you can take a series of pictures with different exposures, and then the software will actually blend those together. And you can get a picture that has the nice sky plus the illuminated church in front. These are called high dynamic range photographs, and they really can deal with some challenging situations quite nicely. You can also use multiple images to do panoramas. The typical way to do a panorama with film would be to take one picture and then just crop it off into a panorama, losing information at the top and the bottom of the image. So you lose some resolution. With taking multiple images, you can take a number of images and stick them together. This is the Oak Alley plantation just north of New Orleans. And it's an amazing place with the oaks coming across like this. But taking a picture here, another here, and another here, you can then blend all these three images together and get an image that includes them all in a nice panorama with very high resolution, because you're actually having the effects basically of three images all put together. And panoramas are something that both Lightroom and Photoshop, for example, do just automatically and do an amazing job stitching them together. You can also just play around with multiple images. These are some pictures I took during a fall foliage workshop. It was a rainy day. And I was just experimenting with different camera motions. Panning the camera down when I hit the shutter or up, also zooming in or zooming out. And this one where I was zooming in seemed to be the most effective and I think made an interesting photograph. And it's the kind of experimentation that you can do and get immediate feedback so you can tell what's happening. Sadly, nowadays, also people do selfies. And this is the typical selfie with me. This is probably the only selfie I've ever done like this, with the background here, the horizon way askew. people taking pictures of their lunch. That's another thing they can do with multiple images. But you can play with it as you like. So multiple images are another advantage of digital photography in a lot of different ways. I talked about having the digital darkroom, replacing all this stuff with programs like Lightroom and Photoshop that allow you to edit film pictures in many of the ways they used to do in the wet darkroom, dodging and burning. And in this picture, you can see over here, I actually burned in a little bit of the barn because it was too dark. So I was able to lighten the barn in just one particular area. And you can do these kind of adjustments much more quickly and accurately and reproducibly, as you could otherwise. Now, a question comes off often when we deal with these kinds of changes. The multiple images, the high dynamic range, the editing in Photoshop or other programs. The question comes up is whether this is cheating. And people who shoot film photography that don't have the opportunity to do a lot of these things will say that they were cheating. It's not really natural. But the question is it cheating? My point of view is that if you're able to use these techniques to get pictures that are closer to what you remember they looked like and how they felt, I think it's not cheating at all. But to ask someone with a little bit better reputation, we might ask Ansel Adams. Are you all familiar with Ansel Adams? Really the penultimate black and white film photographer of the 20th century. You'll recognize his pictures instantly with the style of just an amazing range of brights and darks, all mixed together in a beautiful combination. He shot primarily with film and did his own developing and printing with techniques that involved, for example, maybe overexposing the picture and underexposing the print, all different things that you could do in order to compress that dynamic range that I talked about so that you could see detail in the sky, but also see detail in the shadows. This was a picture of the Tetons from the Snake River taken in 1942. And he just has an amazing collection of pictures, and he's one of my heroes. He also was somewhat lucky. This is his photograph from the Snake River outlook on Route 26 in the Tetons. When I was there just a few years later, things had changed a bit. And I couldn't exactly duplicate his picture in 2012, first of all, because all the trees had grown up. And secondly, the mountains were in the haze here because we were getting smoke from forest fires in Idaho. So, you know, you have to be in the right spot at the right time to get the best pictures. But talking about digital photography, Ansel Adams died in 1984 at a time when the electronic images were just coming out. He was always interested in using whatever medium he could and other tricks that he could get a hold of in order to get the most out of whatever image he had. And in the book, The Negative in 1981, he said, "I eagerly await new concepts and processes. I believe that the electronic image will be the next major advance, the electronic image. Such systems will have their own inherent and inescapable structural characteristics, and the artist and functional practitioner will again strive to comprehend and control them." So he recognized that this was something that was coming, and I am confident that if Ansel Adams was alive today, he'd probably be shooting digitally and editing in Photoshop, because that's the way you can get the most out of your images. So what about disadvantages of digital photography? And there are a number of them. First of all, the cameras are expensive and they tend to become rapidly obsolescent. Camera companies are just continually finding ways of increasing the pixels and reducing the noise, increasing the dynamic range and better autofocus and video capabilities. I would think of these not so much as obsolescence of the cameras you have, but just great advances over time. The camera that you have from 5 years ago doesn't become broken because there's a better camera out there, and they can still shoot excellent shots. A big disadvantage is that you've got to manage your files with storage and archiving. Because here you can't just take a picture and have it on a piece of paper and then put it in a photo album or in a shoebox, which is what I ended up doing in the last years I was shooting film. You have to find different ways to store it. You need, if you will, a digital shoebox to keep track of your images and back them up sufficiently so that if something happens to one area, one disk drive, for example, then you've got backups. Finally, multiple exposures can encourage sloppy techniques. There are people out there who will just take their camera and just shoot every angle in every direction, and then figure they'll come home afterwards and try to pick out the one that's okay. The digital camera and the fact that you can shoot multiple images shouldn't be an excuse for not planning your technique and framing your images to the best possible way. And we'll talk about that when we talk about exposure. So we often refer to this tendency just to shoot randomly and then pick something out is the spray and pray approach to photography. Let's just look at some of the cameras, digital cameras that were out there when I was starting. My first regular camera was this Cammedia, and it was 2 megapixels, and I thought it was magic. The ability to take a picture and then come home and have a file that I could look at on the computer right away was just mind-boggling. The quality wasn't what I was getting with my 35 millimeter cameras, but still it was amazing, and I found myself using it more and more, and it made me want to get better cameras, better digital cameras as they came out. And so I went through a progression of a 5 megapixel Olympus, and then a 6 megapixel Canon EOS 20D, which was my first digital single lens reflex, and then a number of full frame cameras of the EOS 5D, 5D Mark II, and then my most recent camera is up to the 5D Mark IV, which has gone from 2 megapixels initially. Now this is 30 megapixels and a nice big full sensor. So I have kind of worked my way through cameras, but you don't necessarily, some of these other cameras still take excellent pictures. Other disadvantages, the need to have your files stored and archived. When you've been finished shooting your pictures, you're going to have a whole bunch of files to look at. And there was a tendency to think that because the images don't fade over time, like an analog picture can fade in the light, and also because the corners don't crinkle and so forth, that they are somehow more vigorous. But in fact, these pictures are very fragile. As I said, they're just a pile of ones and zeros all put in together in a file. And you can lose files or they can get corrupted. So you have to think about backing up at least your important images. And we talked about spray and praying. I love this picture. Film versus digital photography. Back in the film days, you might have the same roll of film in your camera for weeks, months, in this case, perhaps for years, as it goes all the way from going from the time when he graduated all the way back to the time he was taken home from the hospital, all in one set of pictures. And nowadays with digital photography, you get the who wants to see 83 pictures of my lunch. You're always seeing people taking pictures of their lunch. I don't understand that at all, but that's what you get when you have the digital photographs. The other disadvantage of digital photography compared to film photography is you can't escape from your family into the wet dark room and just close the door all night. So that's something else that I can't do. I'm sitting here right in my office, and my wife can see me off in the kitchen all the time to know what I'm doing. So I wanted to run, hopefully briefly, talking about different kinds of digital cameras. And you folks have a range, I think, of cameras, all the way from a simple point and shoot to a fancy digital single lens reflex, or now a mirrorless camera. One of you has a mirrorless as well. And talk about the advantages and disadvantages. And with that, we can talk more about the nature of cameras. We're going to talk about the camera size, and obviously small cameras are nice. You can stick them in your back pocket. They're unobtrusive. They're less likely to get you mugged if you take them out in a crowded situation. The optics are important in cameras. It's good to know who makes the glass, who makes the lenses of your cameras. I often would tell people that if they're going to buy a camera, digital camera, they ought to buy a digital camera made by a camera company. So for example, by Nikon or Canon rather than by Fujifilm or things like that, because Nikon and Canon have much greater experience in terms of making good lenses. And that's an important part of quality images. Nowadays, there are some companies that are having better glass. The classic example is Sony cameras. Sony has nice lenses. They're actually made by Zeiss, which is a German lens company that's really quite well established and makes good lenses. So you don't have to be a camera company in order to have good glass. These cameras often have zoom lenses, and it's important to make sure that you look at the physical zoom of the lens. Some cameras will have what they call a physical and then a digital zoom. The physical zoom is the actual zoom back and forth that you can get, but the digital zoom, what they're doing isn't really zooming at all. All they're doing is cropping in on the image to make it, to use a smaller and smaller portion of the image. And it gives you the illusion that you've zoomed in, whereas you're just getting a smaller portion, which means you won't be having the same quality. You won't be getting all of the megapixels that's on the sensor. So you want to look at the physical zoom. And some cameras like the digital SLRs have interchangeable lenses, and that can be important. Sensor size is important, and we'll talk about that. Not only the number of pixels, which is what the camera companies usually try to sell you with, whether it's 6 megapixels or 30 that I have now, but the size of the sensor is important. Bigger sensors allow you to have better pixels with less noise because they're not as jammed close together, so you don't get a lot of contamination from one pixel to the next. So it's not just the number of pixels, it's the size, and I'll demonstrate that for you. Cameras take pictures saved as different file types. Typically, most all cameras save as JPEGs. But more and more, you'll have cameras that will also allow to shoot in RAW. And RAW is a format that takes all of the information of the sensor and is not compressed, whereas JPEG, the images are compressed in order to make smaller files. Just out of interest, how many people here shoot RAW? 2, 3. Okay, well, that's good.
No, I don't, I was saying, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I don't know the difference either.
Well, we'll talk about that. And you have to look at your camera manual to figure out whether you can shoot in RAW. Not all cameras do it, but I'll make the case that I think it's important to at least consider strongly shooting in RAW. Finally, we'll very briefly talk about controls on cameras, and that's important as we look at different cameras. I think all cameras have an infinite way of screwing up the pictures, except maybe the point and shoots where you don't have that many options. The important thing about controls on cameras is that you'd like to get cameras that have the most amount of controls on the camera itself with dials and buttons and things that you can work with, as opposed to having controls mostly or all enclosed within that LCD screen and having to go through multiple menus to try to make changes. It can be very awkward. So the more you can control your camera with dials on the camera itself, the better it is, I think. So let's just look at some different cameras. The simple point and shoot has been out there for a long time. You notice it doesn't have a viewfinder. You just look in the back. It can have pretty good megapixels, but here with Fujifilm, I'm not sure the quality of the lens. And you'd have to see what the zoom is. It's a 5x zoom. Again, with this one, it doesn't have a viewfinder for it, so all of your work with the camera is done with the screen on the back. You don't have the option of looking through a viewfinder, and that can be a problem if you're shooting on a sunny day. It can be hard to see that viewfinder. On very dark days, sometimes the viewfinder can actually be better than looking through the physical viewfinder itself. Of course, the thing about point and shoot cameras is they've largely been replaced by the cameras on your phones. As they have gotten better and better, the point and shoot cameras have almost disappeared. They have more and more sophisticated cameras. there aren't too many ways you can improve on the ability of a phone to actually make a call. So if you're going to try to get people to buy new phones, it's often because by making better cameras. This is actually the iPhone 11, and now it has a 12 megapixel sensor. It has 3 different lenses, so it has a regular, a wide angle, and a telephoto. It has image stabilization built into it, so they become more and more sophisticated. This one also has 4K video, which is high quality video. So it's incredible what they have. But despite all of these features, you have to keep in mind these phones have very small sensors, and that can be an issue in terms of the quality of the image. So a step up from point and shoots or phones or more full featured pocket cameras. This is the Canon G11. I don't know if you can see, or if you're looking at me, you can, the G11 here. It's a nice size, more or less pocket camera, unobtrusive, easy to carry around, but it has a lot of neat features so that you can do a lot of the things that you could do on a fancier digital SLR. It is a viewfinder camera. You're not looking through the lens. In Canon, it has good glass, and it allows you to shoot both JPEG and RAW. And again, the controls are a little bit easier, although you do have to deal with screens as well. The big step up is when you get to digital single lens reflexes. Some of you have those. What single lens reflex means is that when you look through the viewfinder up here, you are looking through the lens. So you see exactly what the lens is seeing. The way that is done is with some mirrors and glass. The image comes in, instead of hitting the sensor back here, it hits a mirror, which reflects it up into a big area here with glass and mirrors. And this is called a pentaprism. It bounces around in here and then comes out through the eyepiece. So you're actually looking through the lens. When you go to take a picture, this mirror flips up. The picture is taken, recorded on the sensor here, and then it flips back down again. That gives you that satisfying clunk clunk when you take a picture that has a single lens reflex. These are neat cameras. The disadvantage is you've got all of this glass up here. And the result is that where you have all this up here, the camera of necessity is heavier and bulkier to put it together. So this is a much more intrusive large camera. It has this one has a nice lens with a Canon lens. Comes with the zoom that is the standard zoom that I use most of the time is the 24-105 on my camera. Great camera, but it has this problem with the pentaprism. What's happened with digital photography is that you don't need all of this. You can have a mirrorless camera. One of you said you had a mirrorless camera. And in that situation, instead of having to bounce around like this, the image goes directly to the sensor. You can look at it at the back of the camera and do your compositions there. They also, most of them have viewfinders, which are electronic viewfinders. The signal from the sensor goes to an electronic viewfinder. The quality of those was a problem, but they're getting better and better. And they really are quite good at this point. I should say that digital SLRs also have most of them have the capability of looking right on the sensor on the back of the camera. A lot of them have the ability to lock the mirror up to get it out of the way. So when you look through, you can see the image right on the sensor itself. And that can be helpful, particularly in low light situations. But this method allows you to get rid of all of this weight up here. And you get a camera like this. This is the Sony. Sony's been somewhat of the lead in terms of mirrorless cameras, although that's changing. And there are more and more cameras made by other companies that use mirrorless approaches. They're lighter, they're easier to handle. I think they probably are the future of digital photography. Probably my next camera will be a mirrorless, although I really love my Mark IV. They have to have different lenses generally because there's a shorter distance between the back of the lens and the sensor than there is where you have to have a mirror in the way. So the lenses are different. but you mostly can use your old lenses on these cameras by just using an adapter ring. For example, on a Sony mirrorless, you could actually use Canon lenses with the appropriate adapter. Okay, so that's the range of cameras, and I think we've got some representation of that in our group. I wanted to spend a good deal of time talking about sensor size. And let me say before I go on, is I've been talking a lot, and I really want you to ask questions as we go along. I know I do a perfect job of explaining everything, so there's seldom questions. But if you have them, please bring them out. This is such a small group, we can handle those quite easily. So please volunteer your questions as you have them. Anyway, sensor size, and you remember I had mentioned that the size of the sensor is as important or more important than the actual number of pixels, number of sensitive cells on the sensor itself. This is a Nikon Coolpix L2, a fairly old camera. It's a 6 megapixel camera. It's a pocket camera, you know, there's no viewfinder here. When you take a picture, this goes to a digital sensor. And let's look inside this camera. And here's the inside of the L2. Again, 6 megapixels. And there's lots of electronics here. You'll notice all over the place. This big thing is a capacitor, which is primarily there to charge up before you take a flash. But the question is, where is the sensor in all of this? Can people see the sensor? Say yes, and I'll believe you. The sensor is right here in all of this. That little thing right there is actually the sensor that picks up your 6 million different light sensitive diodes. And you can see here that it is less than a centimeter across. So really quite small. And you have to kind of jam them in to get all those pixels into that little device. If we look at the range of size of sensors here, that camera, the L2, is probably in about this range with a sensor this size, 6.1 by 4.6 millimeters, not even a centimeter across, and quite small. Things have to be jammed together pretty tight here. If we set this arbitrarily as a relative size of 1, we can go up to bigger sensors. The next step up is my G11, my camera, which is 50% bigger in terms of the sensor size, but still pretty small. There is a group of cameras called 4/3 cameras or micro 4/3, most notably with Olympus and Panasonic, which is this size, still almost 9 times bigger than the smallest ones, but not the biggest. We get up to cameras like this, the Nikon D40X. Did someone have a Nikon D40?
I have a Nikon 5600.
5600. I assume, and that's a digital SLR like one of these, right?
Yes.
But
And you know, it's this conversation about sensor sizes. When I bought the camera a year ago, I contacted a friend that I knew was really into photography, and I said, you know, what should I buy? And she said, oh, I only shoot full frame, blah blah blah. So I looked at the full frame cameras because that's what she recommended, but they are very pricey compared to the crop. Is that the crop frame? What that means?
Yeah, we call these crop sensors here.
Yeah. So anyway, it was just out of my budget, and especially for my first time, and I don't know how to do anything on it at all.
Yeah,
So I did buy the cheaper version, but
yeah, the crop sensors are really an excellent choice when you get into photography. Shelley, hello. Are you there? We're not hearing you yet. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me right now?
I can hear you now. So I'm
Okay.
sorry we got started late. Did you think we were starting at 7?
Oh, goodness. I'm Central Time.
We
Sorry.
started at 6. I'm sorry you're coming in late.
Here, pardon me?
I said we started at
It's
6.
o'clock in Yeah, it's 6 o'clock in Minnesota. So I didn't put the two together.
Okay. Well, I think I'm recording this session, so you can go back and pick up the first half, okay?
Oh, thank you.
We're talking about different cameras and talking specifically about sensor size. Do you see the image here with the different size sensors up here and the different cameras? That's the screen we're sharing right now, okay?
Okay.
So we're getting up to the size of this crop sensors. Of course, all of these smaller sensors are actually crop sensors. They're smaller, and we'll talk about what crop sensor means. The APS Canon, for example, has an APS-C sensor, which is 13 times bigger than these pocket cameras, but still not the full size. And you can get a good image on them. There are actually some advantages to having a sensor of this size or smaller as you're taking pictures, particularly with telephotos. So as I was saying, it's a good choice. No problem with that. Then we get up to what we call full frame sensors, measuring 36 by 24 millimeters. And those you'll get in your higher end cameras. As we pointed out, they can be pretty expensive. You pay more for having these large sensors, among other features on the cameras. And they're like 30 times bigger than the small compacts size. So why is this particular size sensor called a full frame sensor? If we look here, this is a Canon 5D Mark III, and it has a full frame sensor in the back. It measures 36 millimeters across. And the reason that this is called a full frame sensor has to do with basically the history of 35 millimeter photography. As digital cameras first came out, the sensors were smaller, and the goal was to hopefully eventually get to the point that a full frame or a sensor could be the size of a 35 millimeter piece of film that you would get out of a standard 35 millimeter camera. And when we got sensors that were that size, those were referred to as full frame. There are cameras that have sensors that are bigger than this. They are incredibly expensive. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. But the full frame sensor itself is in a camera is often several $1,000s. So, but it does lead to very high quality. So this is your full frame sensor. It's important to realize that when you attach a lens to this thing and screw it in, it is a circular lens, and it projects an image on the back of this camera here, which is not a rectangle, but is actually a circle. And your sensor just picks off a portion of that image on the back of your camera, and that's what it sends out to the file that it's saving. And again, it's the size of a 35 millimeter piece of film. Now, when you get down to that next step down to those the smaller sensors, they're often in the backs of cameras that take the same lenses as the full frame. So what happens is you get that same image projected into these cameras, but what they have is just a smaller sensor at the back of it. So this is your crop sensor for the Canon. And when you project that same image here, it goes from that to this. So you're actually getting the same image on the back of the camera as you got with the same lens, but you're just taking a smaller portion of it. And the result of that is that you get an image which is actually somewhat magnified. We call this focal length multiplier, because if you have, say, a 50 millimeter lens on this camera, but you then have it on a crop sensor, it actually looks like it's something that's even longer because the image in the middle here has been expanded. So small sensors, they have some advantages. Smaller cameras and lighter cameras. They have a photo length multiplier, and that's what I just talked about. The fact that with any particular lens, it's going to work as if it's a longer lens because it's taking a smaller portion of the image that's projected on the back. They have a larger depth of field. Smaller the sensors, the larger the depth of field. Again, that's that distance over which the image appears sharp. And they are certainly cheaper. It just can be much cheaper to get these lenses. And oftentimes they're put into cameras that may not be as strongly constructed as some of the more somewhat professional cameras. They have disadvantages. They have a lower quality image. They have increased image noise because you're jamming more pixels into a smaller area. And they have larger depth of field. And you notice I have larger depth of field as both an advantage and a disadvantage. If you're shooting, say, landscape shots and you want to get good depth of field from the foreground all the way to the background, then having a small sensor may be helpful because you have a larger depth. If you're taking a picture of, say, doing a portrait, for example, where you want to have the background to be fuzzy so that you can concentrate on the foreground, then a large depth of field can be somewhat of a disadvantage. Looking at the advantage of full sensors, and here you could just say bigger sensors, because regardless of whether they're full or not, the larger the sensor, the more these effects come into play. Large sensors have higher quality images. You can get more pixels in there, but more importantly, you can get better pixels that aren't jammed together so much. Smaller depth of field can be an advantage, as when we're taking portraits, for example. There's reduced noise, and if you're taking pictures in low light, say you're taking your pictures of the moon or of the stars, you'll have less noise with a larger sensor. Disadvantages, they're larger and heavier. Again, the small depth of field can be a disadvantage in some situations, like in landscape photography, and they can be much more expensive. So you got those two things to balance. I'm going to pound the idea about sensor size somewhat to death here, so bear with me. This is a picture of an arch bridge in Weston, Vermont. And let's for a moment assume that this is our 35 millimeter full frame picture. We've got with the full frame, 36 by 24 millimeters. And let's compare what we see in this image to what we would see if we switched to a crop sensor without changing the lens itself, but just a crop sensor. And this is the crop sensor view that you would get with the same lens. We refer to these as crop sensors because as you can see, they sort of crop the image in from what you would normally get with the full frame. Obviously the image would actually be in the middle here, but I've moved it to try to recompose to the best you can get out of it. We express these differences in sizes with a crop factor. This Canon APS-C that you get with, say, Canon Rebels, for example, has a crop factor of 1.63, which means basically you take the focal length of the lens you're using and you multiply it by 1.63 to get the equivalent focal length if you switch from the full frame to the crop sensor. So here with a 1.63, your 50 millimeter lens suddenly works as if it was 81.5 millimeters. That has advantages and disadvantages, as we will see. Going further, this is the Micro Four Thirds, like the Olympus. It has a crop factor of 2, which means a 50 millimeter lens will now work as if it's 100 millimeters. My G11, my little G11 here, would have this image if it had the 50 millimeter lens on it. It doesn't, as we'll see. The G11 has a crop factor of 4.7. So if I was to have a 50 millimeter lens on my G11, it would be the equivalent of having a 235 millimeter telephoto lens and look in like that. Now, with these smaller sensors, obviously you don't want to have this as your baseline look. So the way they compensate is by having wider angles in their zooms. So the G11 actually has a zoom which only goes from 6.1 millimeters to 30.5. And by doing that, when you apply the crop factor of 4.7, you get an equivalent range of 28 to 140 millimeters in terms of the telephoto. And that's how these smaller sensors are able to get pictures within reasonable ranges. If you look at an iPhone 6 here, it's only 4.8 by 3.6. An iPhone 5 has a crop factor of 7.5. But its focal length of its lens is only 4.8 millimeters, So that translates to 36 millimeter equivalent. So iPhones tend to have pretty wide angles, but not as much as you would get otherwise.
Jeff, can I ask a question here?
Absolutely.
So the information about the crop factor you're talking about, that must be in the manual for the camera.
What camera do you have again?
I have the Nikon 5600, D5600.
So that's the one with the crop sensor.
Yes.
Yeah, it should be in there somewhere. Oftentimes these cameras will have their own special lenses that are designed to compensate for this. You'll have a lens that has a wider focal length than you would otherwise to compensate for the size, but it should be in there somewhere that
Okay.
it gives you that.
Thank you.
But I think with a Nikon, you can also use regular Nikon lenses. And in that case, you just realize, and you'll realize it when you look through it. You'll see what it looks like, what the degree of telephoto is, if you will, by just looking through the camera.
Right. Okay.
So could you do the math again? So is it like I have an APS, so it'd be,
Yeah, this will be on the quiz. So it's,
okay, yes.
we gotta get the math right. You have an APS.
Yeah.
An APS.
APS-C, yeah, sensor,
And it's an APS-C.
yeah,
The APS-C, by the way, the C, APS-C is the one that you see on a lot of Canons and has the 1.6 crop factor. So that, if your camera takes interchangeable lenses, right?
Mhm.
So if you have a lens you put on and you put the lens on and it's a 50 millimeter lens, or say 100 mil, make it easy. If you have put a 100 millimeter lens on your camera, that will work out giving you a range of view, which will be equivalent to having 160
okay.
millimeter lens.
So you're basically just timesing your,
Your times, and it extends the degree of telephoto, if you will, of the lens. And we'll see
Okay.
that in more detail.
One sec, just one sec. Can I ask you a question too? Hi there.
I'm here.
Yeah, okay, just when you talk about this 1.63 crop, in other words, let's say I've got a 50 mm thing. So what exactly are you trying to say? Does it increase the distance that you can actually photograph? I'm not really very clear of 50 mm lens and 1.63 crop factor. I'm not really very clear what you're saying.
Let's go back here a little bit. So basically, if you have let's say 100 millimeter lens on this camera,
Okay,
at a full frame sensor, it would look like this and would take in this amount of the picture. Crop
okay,
sensor, it's smaller, so
okay.
the file you get out only looks at this part, which is just like as if you were just having more of a telephoto lens. Cropping out a smaller portion of the actual field.
Okay. So basically, it'll project out a bit more than what it actually is. Is that, am I assuming it correctly?
Well, the lens projects a certain image on the back of the camera, and it's just how much of that image you grab.
Yeah.
And with a crop sensor, you grab a smaller portion.
Yes.
So it's like you had a telephoto.
Okay.
All right.
Mhm.
Let me show you here. Maybe this will be clear. Crop sensors are actually kind of popular among wildlife photographers because they work to extend the length of their telephotos.
Okay.
You take a picture of this red-tailed hawk and you take it full frame,
Mhm.
you get this field of view.
Okay.
With the APS-C, same telephoto, you
Mhm.
get this frame. So it's as if you have a longer telephoto lens, even when it's just the back is different.
Okay. Just one sec. I have one more question to ask. And like I also have a lens that is 70 to 200. What would that mean? What would that mean if I put it onto my Canon 60? What would that do?
Well, if you took that lens and you put it on a crop sensor, it would be the range of that telephoto would be different. It would be not not going out to 70, but going out to 70 times 1.63.
Okay.
Okay, so, basically more than 100 millimeters. And also when you pull it back to the smallest
Uh-huh.
zoom, you
Yeah.
multiply that by 1.62 as well. So if it's a 24 to 70?
No, it's 70 to 200.
Oh, 70 to 200, okay.
Yeah.
So at 200, it would be more like 300 and something.
Okay. You got
And,
360.
70 would be like 50 or something. Or more.
Yep. All
Okay.
right. Got it. Got it.
Whatever the
So-
range is, it just multiplies it by that much.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
So you got a situation here with your wildlife photographer. If he has a Canon APS-C sensor and a crop factor of 1.6, if he has a 400 millimeter lens, it's going to be the equivalent of 640 millimeters.
So it's a force multiplier. It's a force multiplier.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a force multiplier.
Okay.
There are, 640 millimeter lenses are incredibly expensive, and you can actually get a nice camera body that has an APS-C sensor on it for a lot less. And there are some wildlife photographers who, instead of buying the big lens, will just keep with their 400 and buy a second camera back in order to get that reach. So you get the extra reach in terms of your telephoto.
So you're trying to say that am I assuming correctly when you say that it's actually the lens itself is more important than the camera?
Well, it's more expensive than the camera in this situation because there's a lot of glass that goes into a 640 millimeter lens, whereas the APS-C cameras are not relatively all that expensive. So that you can get a whole camera back, for example, a Canon 7D or something like that, for a lot less than you'd pay for a 640 millimeter lens, assuming you already have the 400 millimeter.
Okay.
So that's the advantage. It's a force multiplier, as you said, in terms of the lens. The disadvantage is if you're taking wide angle pictures, you go out and you buy yourself a 16 millimeter wide angle lens, but you have to realize that if you're using a crop sensor, that lens is going to be the equivalent of 25 millimeters. So you lose some of the wide angle when you do these sorts of things. All right.
Okay.
Difficult concept to keep track of. Just have to think of the relative sizes of the sensors. So another thing that's different when you talk about smaller sensors is image quality. And here I've sort of extended it out. This is a picture of the pasture at Rhodes End Farm in Chesterfield, Great Horse Farm in Chesterfield. And this is taken with a little camera that I have, which is a Canon SX50HS, which has a pretty small sensor. It has a remarkable range of focal length from about 24 all the way out to 1200. But it's a small sensor to be able to do that. But it takes a nice picture. I will agree you like that picture. But it is only 3% the size of the full frame sensor, and you lose something when you go to that small a sensor. You lose in terms of dynamic range, the ability to record a range of exposures from very dark to very light. You lose in terms of color quality and accuracy. You lose in terms of the noise that you get off of the sensor and the ability to record detail. And you can see that if I compare this image to the same image taken with my 5D Mark IV, which is a full frame sensor. You may not see a lot of difference right away, but look at the difference in terms of the quality of the sky, the variety of colors that you can see in this sky versus here. Look at the difference in all the different quality of the paint on the barn, and also in the difference in terms of your ability to see more subtle changes in the shadows here. To look at this more closely, I'm zooming in a little bit here. Again, I think the biggest thing you notice is the difference in the paint on the barn. This is kind of blotched and kind of all one color, whereas you see much better detail and variation in terms of the color and more sharpness in the detail as well. So the big difference is image quality when you talk about having bigger sensors. So which camera do you want to choose? The fact is that all of these digital cameras, perhaps not so much with the point and shoot, can take great pictures. And it depends to a large extent on a number of factors. Probably the biggest is what do you want to use your pictures for, and how much money you want to spend in terms of getting the higher qualities. Expense is an issue. It is said if you teach your kids photography, they'll never have enough money to buy drugs. Because they can't, this is just part of the Canon line of camera bodies and lenses that can just consume your money. The question about what do you want the pictures to be used for is important. I was out snowshoeing with my daughter some years ago, and my camera battery died. And for some reason, and this hardly ever happens, I forgot to bring an extra battery with me. So I was stuck. So I used my daughter's camera, and you got a nice picture here in Freedsom Town Forest in Chesterfield. The thing is that this picture was taken with her iPhone 5. And certainly, as you see it here, it's really nice quality, and I don't think you'd have much trouble with it. The iPhone, if you tried to take this image and blow it up to a large size, you'd begin to start noticing the difference in terms of the quality and the detail. But if you're using this for, putting it on Facebook or sending it an email, this is perfectly acceptable. And if you want to have something fancier, then you're going to need to talk about a fancier camera. But it shows that I had this great camera when I was out snowshoeing, and it was basically just a brick I was carrying around because I didn't have the battery. So the rule is that the best camera you own is the one you have with you. And in this case, it was my daughter's iPhone. And that can work perfectly fine. iPhones, like I said, are getting better and better. This is a picture I took with my iPhone. Sometimes iPhones can be good for macro photography because they do have a deeper depth of field. If I took this with my full frame, I probably couldn't have gotten everything in focus from the front of the buds down to the back of the leaves here. Whereas with the iPhone, it all comes in pretty sharp. So it's a matter of what you have. And I'll leave the final word on cameras to Ansel Adams. Here he is a little bit younger. By the way, when I go out shooting, I always dress like this. I always have the nice jacket and the collar out and so forth and the hat. This is the way I go out. But he said, most important part of a camera is the 12 inches behind the viewfinder, your brain. I really hate it when someone looks at my photos and says, wow, you have a great camera. So, you can get great pictures with really any of the current digital cameras and do fine with them. And you shouldn't worry that much about it. We are kind of behind in time. I'll try to move along. I hope you don't mind if I go a little late, but I love the questions coming in too. I wanted to talk about image types. And I remember I mentioned that cameras almost always can shoot JPEG. You'll see that in most every camera that's out there. And this is a compressed format. The images come in and they get compressed into smaller sizes. They make smaller files. Versus RAW, and not all cameras can record in RAW, although more of them can. The RAW images, the information from the sensor comes into the camera and into the file, basically largely unedited, and they're not compressed. So you have all the information from the sensor right there in the file. This makes for bigger files, but much better quality and the ability to edit them better. So if you go to your camera manual and you look at what kind of file types you can record, you'll probably see some sort of a box like this. This is for my old Canon 5D Mark II. And I have a number of different JPEG files I can record at different different qualities. The largest files with the highest quality down to very small and lower quality. And also you can record in RAW. For some reason, they give you a couple of compressed RAW formats, which I don't really understand the value. Sometimes cameras will allow you to record both a RAW and a JPEG at the same time so that you can see the JPEG quickly and then work on the RAW later. So what's the difference between these two file types? It's the difference between what we call a lossy versus a lossless format. And it affects image quality and file size, as well as your ability or your requirements to have editing done. Common types of the JPEG and the RAW. Let's look at the RAW file first. This is a lossless file type because you're not losing any of the image data when it comes from the sensor into the file. These are the highest quality because they contain all of the sensor information. These are generally recorded in higher bit levels. Images are recorded as just a series of ones and zeros. So basically, the bit level tells you how many different steps, 1 from 0, you have to record a tonal range. 12-bit means you have 2 to the 12th. 2 to the 12th is around 4,000. And that means that for any pixel, they can record 4,000 different steps of tonal range from very dark or very bright to the very darkest. So a big tonal range that you can record accurately. And that increased tonal range makes much better quality. There's also less noise in these files. There's less degradation when editing because you have so much more data to begin with. The disadvantage with RAWs is they are larger files, and you can take fewer burst images. Now, a burst image is when you take your finger and you press it on the shutter and hold it down. Most cameras, when you do that, will click off one image after the other, or click, 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 click. This is great for sports photography. If you're trying to catch something in action and you don't know quite when to hit the shutter, you can take a whole bunch of pictures and then pick the best one. So those kind of bursts occur. But if you have a large file, you can take fewer burst images before the camera has to stop, because the burst images get recorded in internal memory within the camera. And when that internal memory is full, then it has to stop and send that data to the card before it can take more images. It's called buffering. With a larger file, you have fewer images before the camera has to stop and buffer. RAW images require editing, and this is a stumbling point for a lot of people. With JPEGs, the files are edited by the camera without any input from you. And some people like that kind of release. But with RAW images, they tend to be rather flat, and you need to do something to edit them. But there are very simple programs that are available to do that. Now, the JPEGs are compressed, and I love the fact that these are referred to as lossy files. That term I don't think occurs anywhere except in digital photography and perhaps in audio recordings. Lossy files lose part of their data when they come in. The camera does initial editing, and that gets burned in, so it kind of decides on its own how the picture should look. They are recorded as 8-bit images, and so that's 2 to the 8th, which is only 256 tonal values that you have. So you have much fewer tonal values from completely bright to completely dark. And that can be a problem, particularly as you start trying to edit images. Because the images are compressed, because part of the image is thrown out, the camera has ways of deciding what might be sort of redundant in the image. But because they have that compression, they are smaller files and they record quickly. And therefore, you can get more images when you do a burst, when you hold your finger down on the shutter. They are poor quality, reduced tonal range, higher noise, and artifact. All big issues with compressed files. And you should be able to look at your manual and find out where on your camera you can select how you want your files to be recorded. And you can either use JPEG at certain levels or also RAW, hopefully, if you have that option. So let's look at the practicalities here. Here are my JPEG files and my RAW. If we look at the highest quality JPEG up here, and if we record it, this is a 21 megapixel sensor on my 5D Mark II. And by the time it gets processed and compressed, the file size that comes out is only 6.1 megapixels. So it's less than a third of the original size. The result is, if we have a 2 gigabyte card, you can get 310 images on that card before it fills up. And you can get 78 images in a burst. You can hold your finger down and it'll click off 78 times before it'll have to stop and empty the information in the buffer. Okay? AJ, can you see this? You're squinting at the screen. Can you see the screen okay, AJ?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, you're kind of squinting there. So that's a JPEG. Let's compare that to RAW. And here we have the raw file coming in again at the same 21 megapixels. By the time you save the file, it actually turns out to be bigger. It's 25.8 megapixels. And that's because there's a certain amount of overhead that goes into the image as well as the original pixels. So you get even a bigger file. And instead of 310, you can only get 72 images on your 2 gigabyte card. For those of you who are used to shooting film, you'll recognize the number 72 as being 2 rolls of 36 exposure film. That's beside the point. You can only get 13 images in a burst instead of 78. And we hold it down and click off 13, which to me has always seemed to be about enough, but certainly much less. If you look at these numbers, you have to question why you wouldn't shoot JPEG all the time. You can certainly get a lot more on your cards, get more out of them, get better bursts, generally better. So why would you go with RAW? And the answer all comes down to image quality. This is a picture that I took primarily to demonstrate this fact. It's a picture that has good highlights and also good shadows. And I wanted to compare pictures taken with a JPEG, highest quality JPEG, and compare it to RAW, looking at it, just a little section of the tree here. And these are all been processed similarly, so they look the same. This is the high resolution JPEG, and it looks pretty good. But then you compare it to the RAW picture. I hope you can see on your screens the difference. Much better detail. You can see this more prominently in the shadows because it's in the shadows where you have tonal compression, which is more pronounced. But there's difference in the highlights too, if you look in here. And just a much higher quality, more detail, better tonal range than you get in this image up here. There's another example looking at this graveyard in Chesterfield. And here I looked at a section here of the image and a section down with the flowers. And I compared low resolution JPEG, so I'm really pushing things here compared to RAW, and you can see the difference. Notice that the lack of any sort of detail and tonality in the flowers as opposed to here, and the differences in the shadows up here as well. So much better quality when you shoot in RAW and edit in RAW. The question is, are there situations where you might want to use JPEG? The first one, obviously, is if your camera doesn't shoot RAW and you're stuck with JPEG. In that case, I would recommend that you make sure you're shooting in the highest resolution JPEG you can to get the most out of it, and that you do your best to nail the exposure and the color balance. Because with JPEGs, it's hard to edit those after the fact. You don't have the same range of ability to make edits, particularly in color balance, as you could if they were shot in RAW to begin with. So you want to try to nail those things when you do your initial shot. Another reason to shoot JPEG is if your storage is limited. You have a small memory card, maybe a 1 gigabyte card, or you're shooting a wedding and you've got all sorts of pictures and you're running out of memory. You may want to switch to JPEG in order to get more pictures on the remainder of the disk that you have. If you want to shoot a long burst, and here you need a particularly long burst. I mean, I shot this blue heron coming into land on the nest with just my 13 bursts. I didn't have to use all of those. There aren't all that many situations where you have to use more than that, but it might be some situations in sports or wildlife where you might need a longer burst to catch everything that's coming by. Finally, if you can't or won't edit your images, as I said, raw images come out looking rather flat because they haven't been pre-edited in the camera. But all the information is in there, and with some very simple editing, which you need to do if you're shooting RAW, you can get the most out of the picture. So you can edit in Lightroom and Photoshop. If you're scared by Photoshop, Lightroom is an easier starting point. But there are also lots of other editing programs, RAW editing programs that are available. Most cameras have their own proprietary editing programs. Canon, for example, has one that comes on a disc when you get the camera, and you can load that up, and that will allow you to edit raw pictures pretty easily. And there are also numerous fairly easy to use and understand editing programs that are available for free on the internet if you just Google it. So I would argue that you ought to try to shoot in RAW if you can. And like Bart, you want to decide that you'll never shoot JPEG again. Wanted to move on with talking about saving your precious images. Again, they come in just piles of these images on your disks. And we want to talk not only about saving them, but where to save them, how to back them up so that you'll have the maximum chance of keeping them over a longer period of time. First thing I wanted to talk about was naming your images. When you take pictures with these cameras, they often come out with names something like this, which mean absolutely nothing. .cr is the suffix of raw digital files for the Canon cameras. But they come out with these numbers that mean nothing to anybody. You want to start off with a naming protocol, however you want to do it, so that it means something to you and it's something that you can search on later and figure out. I tend to save my files in folders by month. So right now I'm working on the folder within 2021 of April, and all my April pictures will go into that folder. And I name the files to reflect the date that they were taken. This picture was taken at Royalton Falls in Massachusetts on October 18th, 2013. And so my file name looks like this. And I do it year, month, and day. And I do it in that order. And also there's a sequence that each picture has as they come through. But I do it in this order so that when I alphabetize the files within a particular folder, they'll come out looking chronological, so that they will be in the order in which they were taken. Now, you may decide that your naming convention might be that you're going to want to put in the name of where it was taken. It might be Christmas 2010 or Joe and Jeannie's wedding. You can decide what you want to do, but you want to be consistent and have it in a way that'll work for you and that you can use later to find the files that you want. I tend not to put in names of where I'm shooting because I put all that information within the file in what's called the metadata. This is Lightroom, and I upload my pictures in Lightroom, and when I do it, I can put in the name that I want to start with. I can also put in information. This might say, information in here might be waterfall, Royalton, Massachusetts, autumn, that sort of thing, so that I can search on it later. So you got your files again, and you want to figure out how to protect it. This is Bob, who is my next door neighbor. Bob is a world-class lifter, holding lifting records for his age class. And he's standing in front of a closet in his house, which holds a disk drive that I put there to protect it and have it offsite. So that's just one way to protect files, although it doesn't always work, and we'll see how that can fail. But there are a number of places where you can save your files. A good rule of thumb as you're taking pictures is to not think of the pictures as existing until they are at least in 3 separate places. And I would argue you might want to have them one place off-site. And here are the various places you can save your files: the camera, the computer, CD, and so forth. You can save your files in the camera, which really means saving them on the cards as they come out. And I've seen people that save their images on the card, and when the card is full, they take it out, put it aside, and put a new card in, and that's their backup system. It's hardly a backup system because it's only in one place, but it's some way to record it. I think this is awkward. These cards are better now. They don't fail as often as they used to. But it's only in one place, and they're fragmented. So if you have a pile of cards and you want to find a picture of someone, you have to go through each card and open it up and search it individually. So it's not a good practical way to do it. Next step would be to take it and take off the card and put it into your computer. And a lot of people do that. The trouble with saving it on the computer is the computers fill up very quickly with images. And if you get any amount of images piled on there, you get a point where the hard drive on the computer gets full and there's not much room for anything else, not even the programs that you might want to have like Photoshop or Lightroom in order to manage the files. So I do not recommend that you save your images ultimately on the computer. You can use the computer as a conduit to take the pictures off to different directions. One would be to save them on CDs or DVDs. And here, by the way, I'm jumping ahead. I meant to talk about how to upload your pictures to the computer. You can do them off the camera, but I'd recommend using a card reader. These are much quicker and they don't tie up your camera or waste the battery and so forth. You can go to the computer and then go to CDs or DVDs to save your images. These have the same problem with being fragmented. The pictures are on multiple disks. They're hard to search. These worked well for me when I was starting off shooting digitally. I was able to get maybe several months on a single CD. But as my files have gotten bigger and I'm shooting more, when I reached the point where it took several DVDs in order for me to record just October, I realized that this wasn't a practical way to go in terms of the long term. External hard drives are really the best way to go in general. Hard drives that you have external from your computer, attached usually with a USB drive, are excellent places for storage. These drives are getting more and more inexpensive. You can buy a terabyte hard drive for around $100 or so or less. Right now I have an 8 terabyte hard drive here and a number of other backup drives. The thing about hard drives is that they are mechanical devices and they will eventually fail. When you put information on a hard drive, you must always start immediately with the certainty that that drive will fail at some point. And so if you're dependent only on one hard drive, then you're just asking for trouble that will eventually come. So you may actually have multiple hard drives and back it up to more than one hard drive. I actually use hard drive arrays. This is a Drobo system that has multiple hard drives in the box. And when you record to these, they have backup already in place so that if a drive fails, such as the red light here saying a drive has failed here, you just take out the bad drive, put in a new one, it automatically repopulates and all your data has been salvaged. So it's a nice way to have backup for the inevitable deterioration and failure of mechanical drives. Now, you can have all of this backup here on your desktop, and then if you have a fire in the house, what happens? My wife knows that if we have a fire in the house, the first thing I do will be to go downstairs and save my hard drive. And after that, if I have time, I'll come back and get her as well. But the hard drives come first. But if you have a fire, you could lose all this stuff and you're gone. Or it could be a flood or any number of other problems, lightning strike. So it's good to have a backup of your important files someplace else. And that's where the off-site area is important. This is Bob's closet in the house next door. If there's a fire, I know I've got the backup there. Short of a tornado that comes through and gets both of our houses, I think we're in pretty good shape, and Bob's there to bar the door. You'd think this would be a pretty fail-safe way of backing up, but there's a problem. Is despite as fierce as Bob is, his wife isn't. She's a lovely lady who is also somewhat of a neat freak. And when she saw this little nondescript box in her closet, it just didn't fit with her organizational plan, and she threw it out. So anything like that can happen. Fortunately, because it's only one of a number of backups, it wasn't a big issue. But you have to realize that no plan of backup is 100%. Now, you maybe heard about backing up to the cloud. What that means isn't a fluffy bit of cumulus cloud in the sky. Cloud backup is sending your files off over the internet to a company which will then send them on their own system of hard drives. So you're basically putting on somebody else's bank of hard drives, presumably with all sorts of protection in place to avoid problems if things should fail and backup within themselves. It's a good way to do it, particularly if you have a small amount of data. There's a number of good companies that provide this service. One of the more prominent ones is called Backblaze, and they offer unlimited backup, or at least they did when I did this slide, for just $5 a month. So you can back up as much as you want for $5 a month, and they'll maintain it. The problem is you have to back them up. You have to have this stuff going off over the internet. I have, at last count, probably approaching 600,000 images in my archive. When I tried their free trial and I hooked up, I got this screen immediately. Freak out, your data will be backed up in 6,007 days. How long to back up all that stuff? If you don't have to do the math, I'll tell you that that's about 16 and a half years that it would take to back up all my files. So obviously not a good solution for the bulk of my files. Although cloud backup can be good for someone who's starting out, has smaller archive and smaller files, and can start early and then keep going with the backup after that. So it's something worth considering. My cloud backup actually is on my website. The company which provides the website allows you to upload as many files as you want to your own directories and galleries. And I have a gallery which is purely for my archiving purposes. And what I do is when I've finished working on an image and it's where I want it to be, as good as I think I can get it, then I will save that image full size at the highest resolution of a JPEG file to my website. Now, I've talked smack about JPEG files, but once you've fully edited the file, then a lot of the advantage you would have by using a RAW file kind of go out the window, and you can get good results. In fact, when I go to sell pictures to websites or magazines, they will almost always ask for a JPEG file, not for anything of higher resolution.
Can I ask
So
you
I
a
just keep
question?
on, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just my saying. You just mentioned the word gallery. I think it's pertinent only to the other thing. The gallery thing that you're talking about is going out of vogue, and you have to back up. Is that something that's pertinent to cameras as well? Because my Samsung camera has a gallery thing, and they're talking about making it obsolete in the month of June.
Well, this is, the company that provides my website is called Zenfolio, and they're primarily were developed to support photographers and fine artists.
All right, sorry.
And so when you create a website, it's often created around the availability of being able to put images in different galleries of your own making.
Okay, sorry, something else then.
That's okay. So I have a gallery for all the pictures that I took when we were in Ireland a year and a half ago, and a gallery for fall images and so forth. So this particular gallery is a private gallery that no one else can get into. It's called my upload gallery, and it's where I upload my files for archiving purposes. I have about 7,000 of these pictures now, going on 8,000 actually, of the pictures within this particular backup gallery. It's just another layer of backup. So that's the cloud. All of these backup modes have their advantages and disadvantages. Cameras are, that is to say, the cards are short-term and fragmented. Computers fill up quickly. CDs and DVDs are low capacity. They're fragmented, and they also fail. People often think of a CD or a DVD as something pristine, almost like it's a metal thing, but they have a definite shelf life. They begin to delaminate. The plastic begins to separate, so they don't last forever. External drives certainly can crash. That's why if you're going to go to external drives that'll keep most of your data, it's good to have the backups. Offsite can be work well to supplement external drives, but you also have the wrath of Lynn, which can be a problem. And finally, cloud capacity can be low capacity, and they can be unreliable. And I say that because all of these cloud sources are based on a business model. The company has decided they can make money by storing people's images. And tomorrow they may decide that this business model doesn't really work for them and they can just stop. So you always have to be careful about that. There are fairly reliable companies that do this. One is Backblaze, but you never know for sure what they might do. Now, implicit in all of this is how important the images are for you. It depends on how much you really want to work on backing them up and archiving them. There's one other kind of backup which I think you might want to consider for your most valuable images, the ones you may want to keep for long periods of time, and that's prints. I know we're all talking about digital stuff and digital files, but getting your images onto prints can be a good way of archiving them for long periods of time. How long can a print last? This is the first permanent image ever photographed photographed by Joseph Nice, a Frenchman, back in 1827. I won't go into the details of his technique. It involved using a form of natural occurring asphalt that tends to harden differentially depending on how much light is shined on it. When you wash it off, you could get that image. Obviously not high resolution, but this was the picture taken out of his window in 1827. So 194 years, that's pretty good compared to what you might get with the digital backup. From a more practical standpoint, for me at least, this is a picture of Louis Parlin, who is my great-grandfather. He was born in 1856, so this picture was probably taken around the end or just after the Civil War. This picture is very valuable to me, to be able to look into my great-grandfather's eyes at this time. And it's the sort of thing that I think is worth saving. One thing you might ask is where your hard drive will be in 150 years with all your pictures on it, regardless how you saved it. Where's it going to be in 150 years? And do you care? A lot of the images that I take of trees and flowers and waterfalls, I probably doesn't matter all that much. But pictures like this, family pictures, I think have great value to me. And I can imagine they would have value. I would hope they'd have value to my great-great-grandchildren when they look at pictures of me from back in the past. So you'd like to try to save those. Just to make a point about labeling the pictures, it's good to have labels on your photographs, particularly of your family members, so people can identify them. This is the same Louis Parlin a few years later after that picture was taken. This is not my great-great-grandmother. This is Louis's second wife. I kind of like to think that this is Rose, my great-great-grandmother, but I doubt that's probably the case. But in looking at this picture, there was nothing on the back written to tell me when it was taken. So you have to try to figure it out. And there's some clues here. You can see there's an electric cord coming out of the lamp, so we can tell at least there was electricity at this time period. I can't see detail in the calendar back here. Can anybody see anything else that might be a clue to when this picture was taken?
The magazine?
Being the magazine. This is the Saturday Evening Post. And Louis is looking at it, and you can see some detail in the cover, and you can go to archives of the Saturday Evening Post, and I was able to find this. This is the cover from December 8th, 1917. It was obviously what he was reading at the time. So this was end of 1917, beginning of 1918 when the picture was taken. It's fun to have this sort of stuff to look at. And being able to look at these pictures, I think, is of great value. Now, having solid prints, or in this case, slides, can be a problem because they can deteriorate. They don't last perfectly forever. This is my sister and I feeding the ducks on Cuttyhunk Island in 1962. Early Kodachrome film, which this was, Kodachrome Transparencies, the blue dye in those films tended to fade, leaving the pictures looking pink. Still a good picture to have, and I could change it to black and white. But in looking at it, I thought there was still residual of the other colors. And I was able to bring this into Photoshop, and with fairly easy adjustments, I was able to salvage the color back out of the picture and get it to look like that. So with prints like this, you can really salvage a lot of detail and interest. And once I had made this change on this picture, I was able to save the changes that I had made as a preset, and I could apply that to other images.
That was a slide.
This is a slide film, yeah, Kodachrome.
How did you have a certain thing to scan it onto your computer?
Yeah, I can scan slides on and make into files on the computer and then work with them from there. Actually, I can put slides into a rotary and have them scan one after the other, so it's an easy way to do it. I have hundreds of these boxes of slides from my father, as well as from myself. Now, I do make prints of my fine art photography to sell and to display. And it's nice to have these. They're printed with archival ink on acid-free archival paper, and they should last a long time. more than 100 years, particularly if they're protected under UV glass, for example. But again, it's not these kind of pictures that I feel really compelled that I'm going to want to save for long periods of time. Rather, I think it's the family images. Here's my grandson, Owen. And I have to think that perhaps in years hence, some of my relatives will want to see what great grandpa Owen used to look like when he was a baby. And so you want to be able to save these files and have them accessible. And my approach was to try to make prints of them. I have prints in shoe boxes up until the point that I started with digital, and then the shoe boxes stopped and everything was digital and susceptible to being lost. So I went back and I took out the family pictures that were important, and I printed those out. Actually, rather than printing them myself, I brought them to a number of different places to try them out. I found that Monadnock Imaging in Keene was the best, and unfortunately Monadnock Imaging doesn't exist anymore, but they did the best, and I'm gonna have to look for someone else to do it. But these are 20 cents each, so 100 pictures is about 20 bucks. And I have these pictures available. I put them in my new shoebox, and they should be around for a long time to supplement my other backup. So think about prints as a way of backing up. But in the meantime, you want to have the pictures in 3 places. I want to finish by talking about learning your individual cameras. And the problem here is that you all have different cameras, and I don't know how they work. People will come up to me and ask me about it, and it can be difficult. The 4 essential secrets for learning your camera are practice, practice, and practice. And finally, throw away your first 100,000 images. Always a good start. These cameras have all sorts of controls on them, and they're all different places. This is just my G11 again, and it's got a exposure compensation here and a wheel here that gives you different ISO, sensor sensitivity, all different kind of settings that you can place your camera on. If you look at the back, you've got more stuff, more buttons and wheels to deal with. And then you run into what's on the LCD screen. There's exposure range and specific exposure. And here's where you decide you want to shoot in RAW. And you can do white balance. This is a custom white balance setting. All this stuff here needs to be learned. And the question is, how do you learn it? If you come to me with your camera and ask, what I typically will say will be read your manual. But if you're insistent and you ask me nicely, I'll say read your damn manual. Because I can't possibly know all this stuff. I can give you some rough ideas. Your manual should look like this very shortly after you buy your camera, because you're going to have to be working through it. It should be dog-eared and ripped and so forth, because you want to have that with you all the time. So read the manual. The other part about reading the manual is to find the right setting for that and the right venue. And the right venue for me, I would suggest, is photographing your foot. If you look at the manuals, they can be gigantic and they're not written for the average person to read. And if you see my manual for my 5D Mark IV is over 600 pages long. Usually these manuals start with a section, a sort of a quick start section that'll get you into the basics of the camera, and that's great to work through. But after that, if you try to deal with all the other specifics of the controls of the camera, you're going to want to take it a step at a time and take it in little bits. So I suggest getting settled in your couch, put your foot up on your dining or on your coffee table, and then experiment with the camera and go through the pages of your camera, looking at different features, and experiment by taking pictures of your foot so you can see how they come out. So for example, you might want to experiment with choosing focus points. And if you put the focus point here, you'll end up with your foot in focus. And if you put your focus point here, you're going to end up with the outdoors in focus. You can do adjustments at exposure lock. You can lock the exposure for the outside and the inside will be dark, or you can put it on the inside and the outside will be blown out. You can try different kind of metering settings. You can use a partial meter, which just looks at this central part of your screen, or you can do a more general evaluative metering system, and you can see how the differences, what they have in terms of taking photos here of our our poor dog Nellie, who is no longer with us. So there's lots of different ways. What I want you to do is to sit down with your manual, maybe look at 3 or 4 features at a time, at maybe 5, 6 pages at a time. And you could do it, ideally, you want to sit down with a new camera, do it every night for a few minutes, or you can do it just a couple times a week. It's good to have your manual with you when you're out in the field, but frankly, if you try to figure out what you're doing once you're out in the field taking pictures, it's going to be very difficult to get it right. It's just going to be very frustrating. So take it a step at a time and don't be frustrated with the fact that it'll take a little while to figure it all. You need to do that practicing and practicing and practicing until all the controls on your camera become natural and you don't have to look to see what you're pressing. You're going to know what's there to begin with. So take pictures of your foot. There's one more critical tool with doing this, and that's, of course, the wine. You want to take it nice and easy and relaxed and make it enjoyable. Now we'll talk about, I could talk more about individual cameras and individual controls when you're having a camera. This is something that might be appropriate to discuss during the office hours that we'll be having. Here are our regular sessions, and we'll have these 4 office hours, again, 6 to about 7 or whatever time it takes on Mondays. You should be encouraged to come, even if you don't have a specific question, just sit around and chat. That will be fine. But this is, again, another way of looking at our schedule for coming up. I wanted to put this up because I wanted to talk about having people go out on a shoot with us. In past years, I've typically tried to get my classes to go out somewhere to shoot photographs together, going out on a shoot. Last time I did this course, because of the pandemic, I didn't do it. But as I've thought about it over time, I think we can do it safely if we're socially distanced and wearing masks and we're all outside. A number of people have had their vaccines already anyway. So I'd like to try to get at least one shoot in. Typically, I like to get it after the next class because we're going to talk about exposure. So sometime in this week, and ideally it would be Tuesday the 4th. And I say that because if you're out shooting pictures on a shoot, I encourage you to send me 1 or 2 of the ones that you think are your best or that you might need help with so that we could discuss them later, perhaps as part of the next session on composition. So my recommendation would be that we gather Tuesday evening. And typically, whenever I make a suggestion for a particular date, there's usually at least 1 or 2 people who just can't possibly make it because they're working or something like that. I'm not sure how Tuesday the 4th works for people. The idea would be to gather in the evening, perhaps at 5 or 6. The nice thing about this is doing it this time of year is that we have a lot of margin in terms of light to get out and shoot. So if we get together at 5 or 6, we should have time to get some shots off. Do people have opinions about meeting on the 4th?
I can do that.
Yeah, I can do that as well.
Anybody?
I'm all right.
Excuse me?
I'm all right too.
Anybody
I
have?
have to be a little bit later. Are you thinking about in the Keene area?
Yeah, I got to tell you, the place that I have turned out to go to the most, and I could run a whole bunch of possibilities by you, but the one that seems to work the best for most people is right in Keene at Ashwellet River Park. Are you familiar with that?
I am, yeah. So if we did that day, I could do it, but 5 o'clock would be really tough for me. 6 o'clock would be better.
Well, I think we could do it at 6. Basically, you don't have to be there right at time. We're going to have to be socially distant, so it's not going to be a gaggle of people all together. And some people can come in later. It's a small enough area so we can pick you up when you come in. So we could say something like 5:30. And if you come in a little later, that's fine.
Yeah, sure. That could work for me too.
Shelley, I haven't seen your finger up or down here. Jill can do it. How about you, Shelley?
You live in New Hampshire?
Excuse me?
I live in Minnesota.
Oh, well, that's
We're
actually
actually
harder
taking-
for you.
Yeah, we're taking a trip to Georgia that week.
That's why it's still light out where you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you'd like to fly in, that would be fine.
No, but going to Georgia that week.
Yeah.
So where,
Well, what I would
I
suggest
don't know
you
if
do,
that's close, it might not be.
what I would suggest you do is go out and shoot on your own. And then, you can send a couple of pictures on. You don't have to be right there at the time, but if the rest of us can get together, then we'll shoot for, say, 5:30 on Tuesday, the 4th. Ashwellet River Park, everyone knows where that is?
I don't.
Is it
Okay.
start next to Starbucks
Right next to Starbucks, on West Street.
Street? Okay.
I know where West Street is. I think I'll figure out.
West
River
Street
Park.
Heads west out of Central Square.
Okay, yeah, I know where West Street is.
Okay, you go along there, there's a Starbucks, there's the Colony Mill Market.
Yeah, I know where Colony Mill is.
Okay, right across the street from Colony Mill, there's.
All right, got it. I know
Um,
what you're talking about. I know the place you're talking about now.
Normally, I'd say we'd meet around the gazebo, Ashwellet River Park, but they've taken the gazebo down. Maybe it'll be back up by the time May 4th comes, but it'll be in that general area, that open area that we can all meet.
Yep,
and
yep,
Spread
sounds
out, and
good.
take some pictures,
Sounds good, sounds good.
okay?
Yep.
Are there any other questions about all the junk that I've thrown at you tonight?
But it was junk. It'll take time to sink in, and I think I'll be talking to you Monday for just general questions, general inquiries and all that.
That'll be great. By the way, you've gotten clear now. You look much better.
Yeah,
You're not foggy.
I've aged.
Jeff, I did have a question. I've been kind of flipping through my manual as after you were talking. I can't even figure out if I can take raw pictures with my camera or not. So I don't even, I mean, I've tried to look up raw, I've tried to look up file type in the index of my manual, but I've tried looking on the menu on the camera. I don't know.
What camera do you have again?
The Nikon 5600.
Nikon 5600.
Yes, the D5600.
D5600. Okay. I bet you that shoots raw, but and it should be in the manual. Somewhere you should have the option of what files, how your files will be saved. And file type is a good thing to look up underneath.
Yeah, I did look up. We did tell me maybe this will let me know. It did say let me see what it said. Something about, oh, now I lost it. It had letters in front of it, like NER.
There's NEF.
NER.
Something like that. It said NER raw.
Okay, well, that's raw files. You know, the NER or something like that is the suffix that are applied to files when they're recorded raw.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
if there's NER raw, then I think you're shooting raw. And it should tell you from there where on your camera you can go to change the file type that you're recording.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Shelley, how did you end up getting hooked up with us from Minnesota?
Honestly, your photograph had caught my eye on Pinterest.
In what?
So it's kind of bizarre, but it just was like so gorgeous. And I was like, oh, I was looking into doing a photography class, but I thought, well, see what if you teach photography, and then I reached out to you through email and you said, yeah. So I was like, sweet.
Well, that's great. I now know why you were an hour late, because we're dealing with a different time zone.
Yeah.
So for you, is it 1 hour? I guess it's 1 hour, isn't it?
Yeah. So
So it'll be
Yeah,
5
that's-
o'clock from now on for you.
yeah.
And 5 o'clock for the office hours, by the way.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions?
Jeffrey, just one sec. I'm just looking at my camera. It's a Canon 6D. And I'm looking at F is apparently, as we stated, shutter speed. So if F is the shutter speed, and I'm taking photography at night where I apparently need to have less shutter speed or more, what should the number be? 1 is to 1 by 5, 1 by 4, 1 by 6, what sort of?
If it's talking about an F number, it's probably talking about the f-stop, which is actually the way of expressing the aperture size, the opening, rather than the shutter speed. The shutter
Okay.
speeds are strictly in fractions of a second. So,
So
you
F is,
might have 1/125. So 1/125th of a second is a moderate shutter speed.
so, okay, shutter. So F is, you said, is depth of field, is that?
Yeah, the f-stops affects depth of field. We'll talk about that in detail next week.
All right. And what does F stand as? Is this thing? Okay. All right. All right. Next.
And I
I'll
have-
wait for you.
And I will take you through a whole agonizing explanation about where f-stops come from.
Don't call it agonizing because it doesn't
It
sound too
involves
bad.
Math and inverse ratios and squares.
All right.
That if you really want to know,
Okay.
because it's confusing. Because big f-stops actually represent small shutters, small apertures, excuse me. Again, the nighttime exposures depend on what you're shooting. If you're shooting the moon,
Okay.
you're going to shoot it as if you were shooting a beach on a sunny day. It's going to be bright.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you.
So just to finish up, this is my website, partridgebrook.reflections.com. And if you go there, there are links to all sorts of photographs, and also to my blog. If you look at the bar at the top, there's one for the blog, and you can go to it, either the most recent blogs, or you can go to an index, which I have organized the blogs in various under various topics. Or you can go right to the blog by using this ridiculously long thing, which is just jeffreynewcomerphotography.blogspot.com. And again, the links to my blog and my website are on that email that I sent out.
Yep.
And you all know my email.
Yep.
And again, I had the link to the syllabus, which is this as well. But in this particular blog in my set of blogs, there's the introduction, and it includes things like, for this first class, I have all of these different articles that talk about in much greater detail a lot of the things that I talked about today, and we have exposure coming up next week and so forth.
Yep.
So with that, I think we're about done. I hopefully will see you on Monday.
Yep.
And you should go out and take pictures.
Yep.
No reason you have to wait until you finish the whole course to get started with that. We're getting into some neat spring photography with the buds coming out.
Yeah.
We get better and better, and hopefully it'll be really nice by the time we get together for our first shoot on the 4th.
So it's 6 to 7 Monday, office hours,
7 on Monday, or 5 to 6.
5 to 6. Sorry.
Yeah. And I will send out the link because it's a different link.
Okay. All
The
right.
link to the classes is all the same, and the link actually to the office hours will also be all the same.
Okay.
But I'll send out that within the next day or so.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you. Really do appreciate your input and look forward to seeing you again.
Great. Look forward to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
One
Good night.
question.
Night.
Do you have the video recording of the first hour of class?
Yeah, that thank you for reminding me. I got to turn that off now. I will have to let you know where that is, because I'm not quite sure how that goes. It'll be recorded to my own website, and I'll have to figure out a way for you to get it. I'll have to check that with the Keene Community Ed. But you're right. I'm going to stop recording right now. Say bye.